Welcome to Module 4 of North Bay Conservation Corps training. And let's take a look at the contents of the lesson or the training module. We'll start with a brief introduction of areas that we have already covered in the first 3 modules. And then we'll introduce the concept of the success-failure ratio. And then we'll introduce the concept of stress and trauma, and we'll talk somewhat about the background of stress and trauma, positive and negative stress, the effects of trauma, and especially the prevalence of trauma at-risk populations. And we'll look at a video, about a 16-minute video, Dr. Harris, who is working in San Francisco, how childhood trauma affects health across the lifespan. Then we'll take a look at the results of the Center for Youth Wellness Adverse Childhood Experience Study. We'll look at the concept of trauma-informed care. Briefly, we'll go over the neurobiology of trauma and then the impact that trauma has on individuals. So in Module 1, we talked about a definition of supervision and the concept of change, and that we're in the business of actually trying to facilitate change in individuals and the implications that this has. Participants in the module took the behavior change survey, and we talked about the behavior change continuum and the 3 philosophical positions about change along that continuum. At one extreme, change comes from within an individual. At the other extreme, change comes from the reinforcement and stimulation from the environment. So there's the outer position. And then we talked about the middle position. And we talked about some of the behaviors and strategies that underlie these 3 psychosocial theories of behavior change. In Module 2, we talked about supervision as assigned social authority. We talked about the 5 faces of supervision and their implications. The 5 faces of social authority, and their implications for supervision. We talked about a situational model of intervention for supervision. Module 3, we sort of rearranged the roles of supervision. We talked about some tools that you already have, that you already have in your toolkit. And then we introduced the concept of group climate and its importance in working with individuals and the effects of supportive and defensive climates on the individuals that work within these climates. So in this module, we're going to talk about then what is referred to as a success-failure ratio. And this video will present the concept of that ratio and the possible implications for working with individuals who may be considered at risk. Well, there are 3 premises that this is based on. Premise number 1, an individual's self-worth is in large part determined by the ratio of their successes, and we can call that S, to their failures, F. And we wind up with the ratio being successes divided by failures, or S divided by F. In essence, we take the number of successes an individual experiences, we divide it by the number of failures they experience, and that gives us the ratio. In order for an individual to have a reasonably good opinion of themselves, good self-esteem or good self-image, this ratio needs to be greater than 1. In other words, their perceived successes must be greater than their perceived failures. And we can denote that by S divided by F is greater than 1. As an example, suppose you had experienced 10 successes going through your day today. And further, suppose you experienced 2 failures. So you had 10 successes and 2 failures. Well, if we computed your success-failure ratio for the day, it would be 10 divided by 2, which would be 5, which is greater, much greater than 1. So you had a very, very good day. Conversely, suppose your friend experienced 3 successes during the day and 9 failures. Their success-failure ratio would be successes, which is 3, divided by failures, which is 9, which would give them a success-failure ratio of 0.33, which is less than 1. They didn't have such a good day. Premise number 2 says that human beings are social animals who have an innate desire to belong, to be recognized, and to be accepted. And premise number 3, being successful or feeling good about oneself is much more than winning a contest or coming in first. Success is viewed as the individual receiving feedback from their environment that meets their desire to belong, to be recognized, and to be accepted. There are individuals who we work with who go through life generally with a positive sense of belonging, being accepted, being recognized. And these individuals generally receive positive feedback from the environment, and therefore they view the world as a positive place to be. They tend to have the resilience to negotiate life's challenges with relative ease. And their environmental impact profile looks somewhat like the responses under the success column here, the pink column. They experience normal amounts of stress in their lives, but almost no trauma, and they have the wherewithal, the resilience, the support, and the resources to cope with life's speed bumps. On the other hand, some of the individuals who we work with do not go through life with a general positive sense of belonging or being accepted and being recognized. These individuals may receive negative feedback from the environment and view the world as unfriendly or hostile, a hostile place to be. They tend to lack the resilience to negotiate the challenges with relative ease. Their environmental impact profile looks somewhat like the responses under the failure column, and their success-failure ratio is well below 1. They may experience undue stress and trauma in their lives, and they may not have the wherewithal, the resilience, the support, and resources to cope with it. Now, of course, in real life, we don't go consciously walking around tabulating our successes and failures and then calculating a daily success-failure ratio. But at some level, maybe at the brain stem or limbic system level, which we'll discuss a little later on, we go over it a little bit, depending on the amount of stress and trauma we experience. Our minds are continually formulating an impression of what the world is like and how well we fit in it. And this awareness influences our concept of self and our sense of esteem. So the obvious implication is to try and focus on an individual's successes and offer guidance and support when they're in a difficult situation or experiencing failure or under stress. And let's take a look at this concept of stress. First of all, let's define stress as a state of arousal or environmental stimulation, and not something that is inherently bad. And in fact, not all stress is bad, as this Google Images graphic on the screen depicts what is referred to as a curvilinear relationship between stress or environmental arousal, which would be the horizontal axis here, and performance, which is the vertical axis here. This is low stress, medium stress, high stress. This is low performance, medium, high performance. you can see that there is a curvy linear relationship. There is a low amount of environmental arousal or stress that leads to a very low amount of performance. In fact, you can see the individual sleeping here. As the stress increases a little bit, we get to sort of a medium amount of stress that facilitates optimal performance. This is positive stress. It's normal. It results in brief increases in heart rate and a mild elevation in stress hormones. But it's a normal amount. And examples of this optimal stress might be situations like getting married, or the nervousness you get if you have to get up and speak in public, riding on a roller coaster, watching a scary movie, playing a challenging video game, or something like that. But it's a very normal amount of stress, and it really can increase performance. But then, as stress gets greater and greater, we experience what is referred to as tolerable stress. And this type of stress is more severe, but the effects can be managed. And it leads to serious but temporary stress responses that can be buffeted by supportive relationships. But then as stress increases more and more, performance goes down and down, and we get to a point of toxic stress. Toxic stress is a strong, prolonged stress that can disrupt brain development and lead to many debilitating physical, psychological, emotional, and health issues. It's the prolonged nature of extreme arousal or trauma, and the feeling of helplessness that combines to produce very devastating effects. Think of the post-traumatic stress syndrome of returning veterans. Well, here we have trauma and its effects. Individual trauma results from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on an individual's functioning, mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Trauma may overwhelm a person's capacity for coping. It's also related or correlated to a worsening of physical, psychological, and social economic outcomes. As this diagram depicts, at its fundamental level, trauma may result in adverse childhood experiences, which can lead to disrupted neurodevelopment. Actually, the development of the brain is interfered with, which can lead to social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, which can lead to the adoption of health risk behaviors, and eventually disease, disability, and social problems, and possibly early death. Again, it is the feeling of helplessness that is so devastating. Individuals who experience persistent trauma early on will see the world as dangerous, hostile, and somewhat similar to individuals whose success-failure ratios are continuously less than 1. Now, persistent trauma is much more severe and debilitating than a success-failure ratio that is less than 1. However, we might view success-failure ratio as a pre-trauma condition, and that is more readily treatable if we can nip it in the bud. Not surprisingly, trauma tends to be disproportionately represented in high-risk populations. And trauma can be both a consequence and a cause of homelessness. Homelessness could be a consequence of trauma or a cause of trauma. incarceration, substance abuse, poverty. Systems can induce trauma or re-traumatize. Just take a look at our child welfare system or foster home system. And of course, institutional and instructional racism can also be a cause of trauma. But let's take a look at the diagram here. These are at-risk individuals. 98% of female offenders report being victims of interpersonal trauma and domestic violence. 96% of adolescent inpatients report exposure to trauma. 93% of homeless mothers report a lifetime history of interpersonal trauma. 90% of youth involved in juvenile justice system report having experienced trauma. 75% of adults in substance abuse programs report experiencing trauma. And 70% of children in foster care report exposure to trauma. So obviously, it has devastating consequences for individuals and for the individuals that we work with who may be considered at risk. Next, I'd like to share with you a YouTube video of a TED lecture given by Dr. Nadine Harris, and it's entitled How Childhood Trauma Affects Health Across a Lifetime. The video is about 16 minutes long. And Dr. Harris explains that childhood trauma isn't something you just get over as you grow up, and that the repeated stress of abuse and neglect and parents struggling with mental health or substance abuse issues has real, tangible effects on the development of the brain. And this unfolds across a lifetime to the point where those who experience it, high levels of trauma, are at triple risk for heart disease and many other conditions. I'm just waiting for the video to load here.
In the mid-90s, the CDC and Kaiser Permanente discovered an exposure that dramatically increased the risk for 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States. In high doses, it affects brain development, the immune system, hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. Folks who are exposed in very high doses have triple the lifetime risk of heart disease and lung cancer, and a 20-year difference in life expectancy. And yet doctors today are not trained in routine screening or treatment. Now, the exposure I'm talking about is not a pesticide or packaging chemical. It's childhood trauma. Okay, what kind of trauma am I talking about here? I'm not talking about failing a test or losing a basketball game. I am talking about threats that are so severe or pervasive that they literally get under our skin and change our physiology. Things like abuse or neglect, or growing up with a parent who struggles with mental illness or substance dependence. Now, for a long time, I viewed these things in the way I was trained to view them, either as a social problem, refer to social services, or as a mental health problem, refer to mental health services. And then something happened to make me rethink my entire approach. When I finished my residency, I wanted to go someplace where I felt really needed, someplace where I could make a difference. So I came to work for California Pacific Medical Center, one of the best private hospitals in Northern California. And together, we opened a clinic in Bayview, Hunters Point, one of the poorest, most underserved neighborhoods in San Francisco. Now, prior to that point, there had been only one pediatrician in all of Bayview to serve more than 10,000 children. So we hung a shingle, and we were able to provide top quality care regardless of ability to pay. It was so cool. We targeted the typical health disparities: access to care, immunization rates, asthma hospitalization rates, and we hit all of our numbers. We felt very proud of ourselves. But then I started noticing a disturbing trend. A lot of kids were being referred to me for ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But when I actually did a thorough history and physical, what I found was that for most of my patients, I couldn't make a diagnosis of ADHD. Most of the kids I was seeing had experienced such severe trauma that it felt like something else was going on. Somehow, I was missing something important. Now, before I did my residency, I did a master's degree in public health. And one of the things that they teach you in public health school is that if you're a doctor and you see 100 kids that all drink from the same well, and 98 of them develop diarrhea, you can go ahead and write that prescription for dose after dose after dose of antibiotics, or you can walk over and say, what the hell is in this well? So I began reading everything that I could get my hands on about how exposure to adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. And then one day, my colleague walked into my office and he said, Dr. Burke, have you seen this? In his hand was a copy of a research study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. That day changed my clinical practice and ultimately my career. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study is something that everybody needs to know about. It was done by Dr. Vince Felitti at Kaiser and Dr. Bob Anda at the CDC, and together they asked 17,500 adults about their history of exposure to what they called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. Those include physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, parental mental illness, substance dependence, incarceration, parental separation or divorce, or domestic violence. For every yes, you would get a point on your ACE score. And then what they did was they correlated these ACE scores against health outcomes. What they found was striking. Two things. Number one, ACEs are incredibly common. 67% of the population had at least one ACE, and 12.6%, 1 in 8, had 4 or more ACEs. The second thing that they found was that there was a dose-response relationship between ACEs and health outcomes. The higher your ACE score, the worse your health outcomes. For a person with an ACE score of 4 or more, their relative risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease was 2.5 times that of someone with an ACE score of 0. For hepatitis, it was also 2.5 times. For depression, it was 4.5 times. For suicidality, it was 12 times. A person with an ACE score of 7 or more had triple the lifetime risk of lung cancer and 3.5 times the risk of ischemic heart disease, the #1 killer in the United States of America. Well, of course, this makes sense. You know, some people looked at this data and they said, come on, you have a rough childhood, you're more likely to drink and smoke and do all these things that are going to ruin your health. This isn't science. This is just bad behavior. It turns out this is exactly where the science comes in. We now understand, better than we ever have before, how exposure to early adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. It affects areas like the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure and reward center of the brain that is implicated in substance dependence. It inhibits the prefrontal cortex, which is necessary for impulse control and executive function, a critical area for learning. And on MRI scans, we see measurable differences in the amygdala, the brain's fear response center. So there are real neurologic reasons why folks exposed to high doses of adversity are more likely to engage in high-risk behavior, and that's important to know. But it turns out that even if you don't engage in any high-risk behavior, you're still more likely to develop heart disease or cancer. The reason for this has to do with the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the brain's and body's stress response system that governs our fight or flight response. How does it work? Well, imagine you're walking in the forest and you see a bear. Immediately, your hypothalamus sends a signal to your pituitary, which sends a signal to your adrenal gland that says, release stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. And so your heart starts to pound, your pupils dilate, your airways open up, and you are ready to either fight that bear or run from the bear. And that is wonderful if you're in a forest and there's a bear. But the problem is what happens when the bear comes home every night. And this system is activated over and over and over again. And it goes from being adaptive or life-saving to maladaptive or health damaging. Children are especially sensitive to this repeated stress activation because their brains and bodies are just developing. High doses of adversity not only affect brain structure and function, they affect the developing immune system, developing hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. So for me, this information threw my old training out the window, because when we understand the mechanism of a disease, when we know not only which pathways are disrupted, but how, then as doctors, it is our job to use this science for prevention and treatment. That's what we do. So in San Francisco, we created the Center for Youth Wellness to prevent, screen, and heal the impacts of ACEs and toxic stress. We started simply with routine screening of every one of our kids at their regular physical, because I know that if my patient has an ACE score of 4, she's 2.5 times as likely to develop hepatitis or COPD. She's 4.5 times as likely to become depressed, and she's 12 times as likely to attempt to take her own life as my patient with 0 ACEs. I know that when she's in my exam room. For our patients who do screen positive, we have a multidisciplinary treatment team that works to reduce the dose of adversity and treat symptoms using best practices, including home visits, care coordination, mental health care, nutrition, holistic interventions, and yes, medication when necessary. But we also educate parents about the impact of ACEs and toxic stress the same way you would for covering electrical outlets or lead poisoning. And we tailor the care of our asthmatics and our diabetics in a way that recognizes that they may need more aggressive treatment given the changes to their hormonal and immune systems. So the other thing that happens when you understand this science is that you want to shout it from the rooftops, because this isn't just an issue for kids in Bayview. I figured the minute that everybody else heard about this, it would be routine screening, multidisciplinary treatment teams, and it would be a race to the most effective clinical treatment protocols. Yeah, that did not happen. And that was a huge learning for me. What I had thought of as simply best clinical practice, I now understand to be a movement. In the words of Dr. Robert Block, the former president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. And for a lot of people, that's a terrifying prospect. The scope and scale of the problem seems so large that it feels overwhelming to think about how we might approach it. But for me, that's actually where the hope lies. Because Because when we have the right framework, when we recognize this to be a public health crisis, then we can begin to use the right toolkit to come up with solutions. From tobacco to lead poisoning to HIV/AIDS, the United States actually has quite a strong track record with addressing public health problems. But replicating those successes with ACEs and toxic stress is going to take determination and commitment. And when I look at what our nation's response has been so far, I wonder, why haven't we taken this more seriously? You know, at first, I thought that we marginalized the issue because it doesn't apply to us, right? That's an issue for those kids in those neighborhoods, which is weird because the data doesn't bear that out. The original ACEs study was done in a population that was 70% Caucasian, 70% college educated. But then, the more I talk to folks, I'm beginning to think that maybe I had it completely backwards. If I were to ask how many people in this room grew up with a family member who suffered from mental illness, I bet a few hands would go up. And then if I were to ask how many folks had a parent who maybe drank too much, or who really believed that if you spare the rod, you spoil the child, I bet a few more hands would go up. Even in this room, this is an issue that touches many of us. And I'm beginning to believe that we marginalize the issue because it does apply to us. Maybe it's easier to see in other zip codes because we don't want to look at it. We'd rather be sick. Fortunately, scientific advances and, frankly, economic realities make that option less viable every day. The science is clear. Early adversity dramatically affects health across a lifetime. Today, we are beginning to understand how to interrupt the progression from early adversity to disease and early death. And 30 years from now, the child who has a high ACE score and whose behavioral symptoms go unrecognized, whose asthma management is not connected, and who goes on to develop high blood pressure and early heart disease or cancer will be just as anomalous as a 6-month mortality from HIV/AIDS. People will look at that situation and say, what the heck happened there? This is treatable. This is beatable. The single most important thing that we need today is the courage to look this problem in the face and say, this is real and this is all of us. I believe that we are the movement. Thank you.
Well, okay, that was Dr. Harris. Quite an impassioned plea, an explanation about trauma. I'm going to stop this module here because it's gone over about 30 minutes, which is a long time. The next section was going to be a discussion. She talked about the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, and I was going to go over some of the results of that study. I was going to summarize it because that's what she did. And then I was going to talk about trauma and the effects of trauma and trauma-informed care. But I'm going to put that off until the next module. I think the question I would like to leave you with at the end of this module is, what implications does the message that Dr. Harris gave us have to have for us as individuals who are working with people who may have gone through childhood trauma and who now are considered at risk? What implications does that have for us? Thank you very much, and we will continue with this in Module 5.